3 centuries ago, a handful of men discovered a way to make money out of nothing. They didn't dig for gold. They didn't trade goods. They didn't build anything you could touch. They built belief. And from that belief, they created power. They called it innovation. The world called it progress. But what they truly built was a trap. A system so elegant, so invisible, that even the victims became its defenders. It promised prosperity and delivered dependence. It gave nations the power to wage wars they couldn't afford. And it gave bankers the power to print wealth without ever lifting a tool. This was not a scam. It was the birth of modern finance. And like any great illusion, its genius lies in the fact that no one was supposed to notice. Imagine a world where every dollar, every pound, every euro is born as a debt. A world where the moment money enters circulation, someone already owes it. That world is not a dystopian fantasy. It's the one you live in. The system began in candle-lit rooms in 17th century Europe, where kings, desperate for war, begged for money they didn't have. And the bankers, eager for control, offered something the world had never seen before: credit. From that deal between crown and creditor, a new empire was born. Not an empire of land or armies, but of numbers, paper, and promises. An empire that didn't need to conquer you. It only needed you to believe. 300 years later, that empire still stands. It doesn't fly a flag, it doesn't hold territory, but it rules every economy on Earth. Because the trap they built wasn't made of iron or stone. It was made of trust. And trust is the most powerful currency of all. Today, we think we're free. That money works for us. But in truth, we still live inside the machine those men designed. Every paycheck, every loan, every national debt crisis, all of it traces back to a single invention that rewired the world 3 centuries ago. An invention that allowed a few to create money and forced the rest to chase it forever. This is the story of that invention. The 300-year-old money trap that still runs the world today. To understand how the money trap began, we must return to Europe in the late 1600s, an age of kings, wars, and ambition. Empires were expanding, armies were growing, and the appetite for power was endless. But there was one problem: gold. There was never enough of it. For centuries, gold and silver had been the heartbeat of every economy. They were tangible, limited, and real. If you didn't have them, you couldn't wage war. You couldn't build ships. You couldn't rule. But as wars grew more expensive, kings discovered a painful truth. Their vaults could not keep up with their dreams. And so they turned to men who could offer something more flexible than gold. Something far more dangerous. Those men were the early bankers, merchants who realized that trust could be traded like metal, and promises could be as powerful as gold itself. They didn't need mines. They needed belief. And with belief came the birth of paper money. The transformation began in England in 1694, when King William III faced a financial crisis. The country was drowning in debt from war against France. The treasury was empty. The crown's credit was collapsing, so a group of wealthy merchants made a proposal. They would lend the government $1.2 million, a fortune at the time, in exchange for something extraordinary: the right to create money out of the debt itself. That deal gave birth to the Bank of England. It was the first time in history that a private institution was granted the power to issue money, not backed by gold in full, but by government promises. The notes they printed were not gold. They were claims to gold. And yet people accepted them because they trusted the king's signature behind the promise. That moment changed everything. Money was no longer a thing. It became an idea, an agreement between belief and authority. From then on, every war, every empire, every industrial leap would be financed not by treasure, but by credit. And the bankers discovered something revolutionary. When money could be created with ink and paper, its supply was limited only by the willingness of governments to borrow. The crown needed money to fight wars. The bankers needed wars to lend money. Together, they built a partnership that would define the next 3 centuries. The public believed they were paying taxes to support their nations. In truth, they were paying interest on debt created by private banks. A new power structure emerged, invisible but absolute. Governments ruled by law, bankers ruled by debt. And once that door opened, it would never close again. What began as a solution for one king's financial crisis became the foundation of the modern world. The old world ran on gold. The new one ran on promises. And from those promises came the greatest financial invention of all time. An invention that turned paper into power and made the few who understood it masters of the many who did not. That invention was credit. Credit. A simple word that hides the most powerful force in modern civilization. It means to believe. And in the 18th century, belief became a business. The invention of credit changed the meaning of wealth itself. Before it, you had to earn money, mine it, or trade something of value to possess it. After it, money could be summoned from the future, borrowed against tomorrow's labor, tomorrow's taxes, tomorrow's dreams. It was genius, and it was dangerous. When the Bank of England began issuing paper notes, they weren't just lending gold. They were lending promises. They discovered that not everyone would come to claim their gold at once, so they printed more notes than gold reserves they held. Each note represented value that didn't yet exist, and as long as the people believed, the system worked. This was the birth of fractional reserve banking, the financial trick that allows banks to lend far more money than they actually possess. For every pound of gold in the vault, they could issue multiple pounds in paper. And when borrowers repaid with interest, the bank grew richer. Not from producing anything real, but from multiplying promises. Governments quickly saw the power of this system. They could borrow to fund wars, exploration, and empire building, all without raising taxes immediately. Debt became invisible wealth. It fueled armies, built ships, and expanded colonies. The industrial world was born not from labor alone, but from loans. But behind every note, behind every new coin, there was a hidden cost. Interest. And interest was the quiet reaper. It ensured that the debt could never truly be repaid, only rolled forward, multiplied, and transferred. A single war could finance generations of payments. A single loan could enslave an entire nation's future. The brilliance of the system was that it appeared fair. It looked like progress. Governments got money when they needed it. Citizens got stability. Markets grew. But beneath that illusion, something darker took root. A cycle that would never end. Because credit demands faith, and faith must be renewed continuously. If people ever stopped believing that their paper was worth something, the entire system would collapse. So every institution, every government, every bank worked to maintain one illusion. That debt equals wealth. The merchants of money had discovered something alchemists never could. How to create gold from nothing. How to sell time itself. How to enslave the future by lending the present. Soon, other nations copied the model. France, the Netherlands, Prussia, America. Each built their own versions of the same machine. And once that machine began to turn, it was impossible to stop. Money became infinite. But so did debt. And that is the hidden paradox of the modern world. Every dollar that enters the economy is someone else's obligation to repay. Money and debt are two sides of the same coin. You cannot create one without creating the other. 300 years later, we still call it the economy. But in truth, it is a grand equation of belief, interest, and time. A system that feeds on our trust and multiplies our dependence. The invention of credit didn't just change finance. It changed freedom. Because from that moment on, the world no longer worked for money. It worked for debt. The trap was elegant. It didn't need violence. It needed belief. Once governments accepted the idea of borrowing against the future itself became collateral. Wars could be fought with tomorrow's taxes. Empires could expand on promises yet to be fulfilled. And entire nations could be enslaved not by chains, but by compound interest. This was the quiet revolution. A world ruled not by monarchs, but by moneylenders. Not by armies, but by accountants. The battlefield was no longer fought with swords. It was fought with signatures. In 1694, when the Bank of England began lending to the crown, it set a precedent that echoed across centuries. The government would issue bonds, IOUs, promising to repay with interest. The bank would buy those bonds, then issue notes backed by them. And those notes became the money of the realm. Money created from debt. Debt backed by faith. Faith enforced by law. It was the perfect loop. a self-sustaining system where every new pound of money was born already owing its creator's interest. To keep the system alive, more money had to be borrowed. To pay old debt, new debt had to be created. And so the wheel turned endlessly. This is what economists now call the national debt. But to those who designed it, it was the foundation of control. Because once a nation owed money, its policy could be influenced, its leaders could be pressured, its people could be taxed. Not for progress, but for payment. And the longer the debt lasted, the more dependent the state became on its lenders. The trap wasn't meant to kill, it was meant to drain. Slowly, quietly, perpetually. The genius of the system is that no one notices. People see roads being built, wars being fought, currencies being printed, and they think it's progress. But behind the scenes, every note, every bond, every stimulus is another thread in the web of debt. The trap feeds itself through interest, the invisible tax on time. If you owe $100 and must pay $105 next year, that $5 doesn't exist yet. It must be created, which means someone, somewhere, must go into debt for it to exist. That's why the total debt of the world can never shrink. It can only grow. It's a design, not a failure. From the very beginning, the architects of this system knew one truth. So long as people chase money to survive, they will never question who creates it. This was the birth of fractional reserve banking, the mechanism that allowed banks to lend more than they owned, and governments to borrow more than they could repay. It turned finance into faith, and faith into profit. Wars fueled it. Colonies sustained it. Industrial revolutions accelerated it. But make no mistake, behind every era of growth was another layer of debt. Behind every boom was a hidden chain. The system doesn't collapse because it doesn't need to. It resets, reinvents, and expands. Every century, it takes a new form. But the principle never changes. The 300-year-old money trap is not about stealing wealth once. It's about harvesting it forever. And the most brilliant part? It makes you believe it's your choice. You take a loan to study, a loan to live, a loan to survive, and you think it's freedom. But freedom that must be financed is just another word for control. This is the secret the bankers of the 18th century discovered. That the surest way to rule a man is not to chain his hands, but to chain his time. And that chain is called debt. Every system has a cost. And the price of this one has been paid in human lives, generations of labor, and centuries of quiet servitude. The money trap did not just build wealth, it built empires. But those empires were not built on freedom. They were built on debt. From the 18th century onward, nations began borrowing not just for war, but for civilization itself. Railroads, factories, colonies, and revolutions. All financed by invisible credit drawn from private banks. The world we call modern was born from loans. The British Empire became the richest on earth, not because of the gold it conquered, but because of the debt it managed. Every war it fought, every port it built, every colony it ruled, was backed by bonds sold to investors who never saw the battlefields. For them, war was not tragedy. It was business. When Britain colonized India, Africa, and parts of Asia, it did so with borrowed money. But the interest was paid by the labor of those who were conquered. Entire nations became revenue streams. Their resources, their sweat, their futures, converted into numbers on ledgers in London. Debt became the invisible weapon of empire. Armies occupied land, banks occupied time. In America, the same pattern emerged. The Revolutionary War was financed by French loans, the Civil War by bond sales to private investors. Every conflict deepened the cycle. Destruction followed by reconstruction, both funded by debt. And with each century, the trap grew smarter. In the 19th century, debt built the railroads that connected nations. It financed factories that turned raw materials into profit. It fueled the Industrial Revolution. And with it, the rise of the working class. But here's the irony. Even as workers built wealth for their nations, their labor serviced debts they never created. Every paycheck they earned was taxed to repay loans made generations before. They thought they were free citizens. In truth, they were paying interest on empires. The same cycle repeated after every major crisis. After the Great Depression. After World War I. After World War II. Each time, governments borrowed to rebuild. And each time, the interest bound them tighter to the same system. By the 20th century, debt had become the bloodstream of global economics. Nations no longer asked whether to borrow, only how much. And as long as they kept borrowing, the illusion of prosperity continued. But the cost was hidden in plain sight. Inflation quietly eroded the value of money. Taxes rose to service growing debts. And the working class, generation after generation, kept running faster just to stay in place. The bankers didn't need to take over governments. Governments came to them willingly. Because once a nation depends on borrowed money, it can never truly be independent again. This is the unspoken truth of global finance. Behind every skyscraper, every stock market, every boom in prosperity, there's a bill being written. And it's the ordinary people who pay it. They pay it through rising prices, shrinking savings, and endless anxiety over money. They pay it through the debt that follows them from birth to death. Student loans, credit cards, mortgages, national deficits. The cost of the system isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in time, the years we trade for money that loses value faster than we can earn it. That is the price of belief. That is the cost of trust. And yet, the world keeps running on the same illusion, because the alternative would mean questioning everything. The bankers of old knew this well. You don't need to conquer people with guns when you can conquer them with debt. Debt that feels like opportunity. Debt that feels like choice. Debt that feels like life. That is the true cost of the 300-year-old money trap. It doesn't just drain economies, it drains hope. By the dawn of the 20th century, the money trap had already conquered the world. But like all great systems, it evolved, quietly, strategically, and with purpose. The first evolution came through centralization. As economies grew, private banks became too fragmented to control the flow of credit. Crises and bank runs revealed the system's fragility. People would rush to withdraw money that didn't really exist. And so, the world's most powerful nations began creating central banks, institutions designed to regulate all others, to act as the lender of last resort, and to preserve confidence in the illusion. But central banks were not neutral. They were built to protect the system, not reform it. Their real purpose was simple: ensure that the debt cycle never stops. In 1913, the United States created the Federal Reserve, a private bank with public power. It could issue money backed not by gold, but by government debt. Every dollar it created entered circulation as someone's liability. It was a new era, the age of controlled debt. The illusion deepened. Money no longer represented gold stored in vaults. It represented the promise of repayment, the belief that tomorrow would always come. The world had officially moved from hard money to faith money. Then came the next evolution, the gold standard. For centuries, gold had been the anchor of trust, the guarantee that money had tangible value. But by the mid-20th century, that link became too restrictive. The machine of debt needed freedom to grow. So one by one, nations abandoned gold. In 1971, President Richard Nixon made it official. The United States severed the dollar's connection to gold entirely. Money was no longer backed by anything real, only by confidence in government. It was the perfect system for infinite debt creation. The trap had gone global. From that moment on, money became pure abstraction, digits on screens, promises in code. It could be printed, borrowed, multiplied at will. And because every new dollar was born as debt, the world's total debt could only grow. Banks could now create money with a keystroke. Governments could finance deficits without consequence, at least in appearance. Corporations could leverage billions on speculation. And consumers were invited to join the game, one credit card at a time. This was the great democratization of debt. No longer confined to kings or empires, it entered every household. You didn't need royal blood to borrow anymore. You just needed a pulse. Mortgages, student loans, car payments, medical debt. The machinery of modern life became a mirror of the system first designed 300 years earlier. Only now it was personal. The result was explosive growth. Cities rose, industries boomed, markets expanded beyond imagination. But beneath the surface, the foundation was the same fragile promise: perpetual debt paid with future labor. Then came the digital age. Money became code. Transactions became instant, and control became invisible. The trap had evolved once more, from paper to pixels, from ledgers to algorithms. Central banks learned to manipulate entire economies with a few strokes on a keyboard. They called it quantitative easing, monetary policy, liquidity support. But the principle was unchanged. Create new money, lend it into existence, and keep the system breathing. Debt was no longer a burden to avoid. It was the oxygen of the global economy, and anyone who tried to live without it suffocated. In just 3 centuries, money had transformed from metal to paper, from paper to code. But one thing never changed. It was never truly yours. The bankers of old would have marveled at the sophistication of today's system. They built the trap with quills and ledgers. Their descendants maintain it with servers and algorithms. But the outcome is identical. The world is still paying for the first loans ever made. The interest never stopped. It only grew smarter. Look around you. The 300-year-old money trap is no longer hidden in royal vaults or bankers' ledgers. It lives in your wallet. It lives in your phone. It lives in every transaction you make. We call it the modern economy. But it's the same mechanism, just faster, sleeker, and more addictive. Today, you don't need a king to borrow from a bank. You can do it with a click, a few digits on a screen, and suddenly, you owe. Your future has already been sold. Credit cards, student loans, mortgages, they all promise opportunity. But in truth, they are the new chains. Invisible, polite, and perfectly legal. You graduate with debt before you earn your first paycheck. You buy a home you don't own until the bank says so. You work decades not to build wealth, but to repay what was created from nothing. And every time you swipe, tap, or sign, the trap tightens. Inflation, national debt, quantitative easing. These aren't accidents. They are the natural symptoms of a system designed to expand endlessly. When governments print more money to cover their debts, they dilute yours. Your savings shrink. Your cost of living rises. And yet, they tell you it's growth. In truth, the system runs on borrowed time. Literally. Every dollar in circulation is someone's debt with interest attached. To keep the system alive, more debt must always be created. That's why every generation owes more than the one before. It's not mismanagement. It's mathematics. The 2008 financial crisis revealed this truth in daylight. Banks lent money they didn't have to people who couldn't repay, to buy assets that weren't worth the price. When it collapsed, governments printed trillions to save the very institutions that caused it. The same banks that had created the problem were paid to fix it, with the people's money. The pattern repeats because the foundation never changed. The system is debt-based, not value-based. And in a debt-based world, stability is an illusion. Today, global debt exceeds hundreds of trillions of dollars, more than all the money, goods, and services on Earth combined. It's a debt that can never be repaid. And that's the point. Because as long as it can't be repaid, the trap remains closed. We've traded gold for credit, labor for leverage, and ownership for access. We don't own our money. We rent it. Every paycheck passes through the same invisible toll gate: interest, tax, and inflation. 3 centuries ago, that toll was charged to kings. Now, it's charged to everyone. And while the system grows more digital, it also grows more centralized. Every transaction, every digital coin, every balance is traceable, controllable, and reversible. It's not just about money anymore. It's about data, about control. The architects of modern finance don't need armies. They have algorithms. They don't conquer nations. They manage them. The trap has evolved from paper promises to programmable money, from debt that enslaves the body to debt that governs behavior. People think they're free because they can buy what they want. But freedom that depends on credit is not freedom at all. It's permission. And the more digital our money becomes, the less control we truly have over it. The next evolution, central bank digital currencies, will complete the circle. Money that can be created, tracked, and deleted at will. The final phase of a 300-year-old experiment in control. The same trap that began in candle-lit rooms now glows on your smartphone screen. And it still whispers the same promise. Borrow, consume, believe. But behind that promise lies the same truth it always did. Money is not yours. It never was. The 300-year-old money trap is not just a financial system. It is a belief system. A story the world agreed to tell itself, and then forgot it was fiction. At its core, Money is trust. It only works because we agree it does. A piece of paper, a digital number, a promise on a screen. None of it has intrinsic value. But because we believe in it, we build our entire lives around it. That is the genius of the trap. It doesn't need to force obedience. It simply makes you believe that obedience is survival. You wake up every morning chasing numbers that vanish the moment you spend them. You call it work, career, success. But in truth, it is the ritual of faith. Faith in a system that rewards you just enough to keep you running. And the higher you climb, the deeper you sink. Because wealth in a debt-based world is not freedom. It is proximity to the source of credit. The closer you are to where money is created, the richer you become. The further you are, the harder you must labor to earn what others print. This is why the system never truly changes. Because it doesn't rely on tyranny. It relies on consent. It relies on billions of people believing that their labor, their savings, their taxes, all mean progress. But progress for whom? The trap survives not because it is hidden, but because it is accepted. Because questioning it feels like heresy. Because we are taught from birth that money equals security, success, even morality. We are taught to measure our worth in digits, not in freedom. And yet, once you see it, once you understand how the system feeds on belief, the illusion cracks. You begin to realize that the power was never in the paper. It was always in the people. When people lose faith in money, the system trembles. When they stop borrowing, it suffocates. When they refuse to trade their time for debt, it begins to die. That is why fear is necessary. Fear of scarcity, fear of missing out, fear of collapse. Fear keeps belief alive. It ensures you never ask the most dangerous question of all. What if money isn't real? Because if money is just belief, then belief can be withdrawn. And if belief can be withdrawn, then the entire empire of debt, 3 centuries of control, can vanish overnight. But most will never see it that way. They will keep believing. Because belief feels safe, and safety feels priceless. The lesson of the 300-year-old money trap is not about economics. It's about psychology. The system is not held together by gold, or laws, or even governments. It's held together by us. Every time we accept debt as normal, we reinforce the system. Every time we trade our time for devaluing currency, we feed it. Every time we measure our worth by money, we worship it. The architects of this system understood human nature better than any economist ever could. They knew that people would rather believe a comfortable lie than face an uncomfortable truth. They built an empire not on gold, but on human faith. And as long as that faith holds, the empire stands. But if it ever breaks, if enough people see through the illusion, the system will collapse faster than it was built. Because belief can take centuries to build, but only a moment to lose. That is the real lesson. Money has power only because we give it power. And the moment we stop believing, the trap opens. 300 years ago, a few men discovered how to turn paper into power. They didn't build empires with armies. They built them with agreements, interest, and illusion. They called it finance. We called it progress. But history will remember it as the longest-running con ever accepted by the human race. Because what began as a clever invention, a way to fund wars and grow nations, became a system that quietly enslaved the world. Not through force, but through faith. Not through chains, but through choices. Today, we call it the global economy. But look closely. It is the same machine that began in the 17th century. Money created as debt. Debt repaid with labor. Labor taxed to fund more debt. A cycle so old, so normalized, that no one even questions it anymore. We celebrate rising markets, booming housing prices, new credit access. But all of it is expansion built on the same foundation. Borrowed time. The illusion of endless growth in a finite world. And the more we borrow to sustain it, the deeper we sink. Because every dollar of prosperity we enjoy today is a promise made by the future. A future that must work harder, pay more, and own less to keep the illusion alive. The 300-year-old money trap was never about taking everything at once. It was about taking slowly, quietly, invisibly. It was about making the cage so comfortable that no one wanted to leave. And yet, The truth has always been in plain sight. It's printed on every bill, stamped on every coin. In God we trust. Not in gold, not in work, in trust. Because the system's real currency is not money, it's belief. If the world stopped believing in the promises printed on paper, the entire edifice would crumble overnight. No wars required. No revolutions needed, just disbelief. That is the fragility of power built on faith. And that is why the system guards belief above all else. So as you listen to this, remember, the trap still works not because it's hidden, but because it's familiar, because it's convenient, because it feels normal. But the moment you see it, truly see it, you begin to understand what freedom actually means. It doesn't come from wealth. It comes from awareness. Because once you know how the trap was built, you can choose not to step inside. 300 years of history have led us here, to a world that measures everything in money and almost nothing in truth. And yet, history itself whispers a warning. The 300-year-old money trap didn't enslave nations with chains. It did it with debt. And the more we borrow, the tighter it gets. If this changed how you see money, hit subscribe. Because history doesn't repeat, it compounds.